Human societies operated with structured rules long before those rules were formalized, named, or symbolized. This is before logic, a history of rules before they were written. This period predates written language, numerical notation, and explicit systems of reasoning. The earliest forms of rule following are observable in contexts of survival, repeated practice, and interaction with stable environmental conditions. These rules were not articulated as principles, but were embedded in behavior and enforced through consequence. Archaeological and anthropological evidence indicates that early human groups relied on learned regularities to manage uncertainty. Certain actions consistently produced favorable outcomes, while others resulted in harm or failure. Over time, behaviors associated with reliable outcomes were repeated and transmitted, while unsuccessful behaviors were abandoned. This process did not require abstraction or explanation. It depended on observation, memory, and adjustment. Such rule following is distinct from instinctive behavior. Instinct is genetically encoded and operates without learning. The behaviors observed in early human societies required acquisition through experience and social transmission. This places early rule following within the domain of learned constraint rather than inherited reflex. In the absence of formal representation, rules existed as patterns of action. These patterns were stabilized through repetition and imitation. Tool production provides clear evidence of this process. Certain stone tool technologies required ordered sequences of action in which later steps depended on the correct execution of earlier ones. Archaeological analysis shows that deviation from these sequences resulted in failed tools. The constraints governing production were imposed by material properties rather than abstract reasoning. Experimental and archaeological studies of stone tool manufacture indicate that successful production depended on specific physical parameters. In bifacial toolmaking, the angle, force, and point of impact determined whether a controlled fracture propagated through the stone. If these conditions were not met, the material failed to produce a usable edge. These constraints were imposed by the physical properties of the stone rather than by conceptual evaluation. Rule following in this context consisted of adapting action to material constraint rather than applying generalized principles. These constraints did not exist as general rules. Each was tied to a specific practice and context. There is no evidence that such constraints were evaluated independently of their outcomes. Correctness was defined by functional success rather than internal consistency or theoretical justification. Beyond material production, rule following also governed perception and movement within space. Visual occlusion imposed consistent constraints on action. Objects positioned between an observer and a target limited access and visibility. Movement during hunting or gathering required attention to these spatial relationships. Actions that maintained concealment or line of sight produced different outcomes than those that did not. Such spatial constraints were learned through repeated experience rather than formal instruction. Fixed landmarks played a role in stabilizing movement across terrain. Mountains, river courses, and horizon features provided stable reference points that allowed orientation to persist across time. Movement was adjusted relative to these features, which did not change with position or direction. The reliability of such reference points reduced disorientation and supported coordinated travel. Thermal conditions imposed additional constraints on behavior. Heat retention depended on density, insulation, and proximity. The layering of animal skins, the use of shelters, and the clustering of individuals followed consistent patterns of effectiveness. These practices were not derived from formal understanding of heat transfer, but from observable outcomes such as warmth retention and survival. Fire management required continuous adjustment to physical feedback. The addition of fuel sustained combustion, while excessive heat damaged food or materials. Insufficient fuel allowed fires to extinguish. Regulation occurred through observation of visible and tactile effects, rather than through abstract calculation. Repeated interaction with fire reinforced stable practices for cooking, heating, and protection. Seasonal variation further constrained action. Materials behaved differently under cold or wet conditions. Frozen ground altered the force required for tool use, while moisture affected fuel quality and shelter integrity. Practices adjusted to these conditions through repetition and correction. Rule following consisted of modifying action in response to predictable seasonal effects. Temporal constraints shaped activity patterns. Daylight enabled movement and visual coordination, while darkness increased risk. Activities were therefore distributed unevenly across light conditions. This division did not require formal scheduling, but emerged from the consistent consequences associated with visibility and fatigue. Biological limits imposed further structure. Sustained effort led to exhaustion, while rest restored capacity. Work patterns adjusted to these limits through experience. Overexertion reduced effectiveness and increased risk, reinforcing the spacing of labor and recovery without explicit time measurement. Energy expenditure constrained subsistence strategies. Practices that required more energy than they produced were gradually abandoned. Foraging, hunting, and transport followed patterns that balanced effort against return. These constraints were enforced by bodily fatigue and nutritional outcome rather than conscious optimization. Auditory feedback also guided action. In tool production, sound provided immediate information about material integrity. Differences in resonance or impact noise signaled whether a strike was effective or damaging. Such feedback allowed correction without visual confirmation and reinforced appropriate technique. Sound reflection within enclosed spaces provided information about distance and enclosure. Echoes varied with surface proximity and space volume. While there is no evidence of systematic analysis, repeated exposure allowed practical assessment of enclosed environments. Binding and joining practices imposed topological constraints. The use of sinew, fiber, or plant material to secure objects required specific sequences of wrapping and tension. Incorrect execution resulted in failure under load. Successful bindings created stable functional units, while failed bindings reinforced corrective repetition. The transmission of rules relied primarily on observation and imitation. Knowledge was not detached from individuals or situations. Practices were learned by watching skilled members of the group and reproducing their actions. This mode of transmission limited variation and reinforced stability. Deviations were corrected through immediate feedback rather than explanation. Because rules were embedded in practice, they were resistant to rapid change. Modification occurred gradually and usually in response to repeated failure rather than deliberate experimentation. This incremental adjustment reduced risk in environments where error carried high costs. Stability was favored over innovation. As group size increased, rule following extended beyond interaction with materials and environments and into social coordination. Practices governing movement, resource distribution, and cooperative activity reduced uncertainty within groups. Consistent adherence to these practices limited conflict and increased predictability. stable social coordination depended on shared expectations formed through repeated interaction. Individuals adjusted their behavior based on anticipated responses from others, which were themselves shaped by prior encounters. Over time, this mutual adjustment produced predictable patterns of conduct without requiring explicit agreement or articulated norms. Deviation from established practice carried social consequences. These could include loss of cooperation, exclusion from shared activities, or reduced access to resources. Such outcomes reinforced adherence without the need for abstract justification. Compliance functioned as a means of maintaining predictability rather than expressing shared belief. At this stage, rules were not abstracted or generalized. They were enacted rather than examined. There is no evidence that early human groups treated rules as objects of thought. Rules functioned as constraints on action, not as propositions subject to evaluation. Despite this, certain structural features were already present. Consistency mattered. Repeated contradiction between expectation and outcome produced instability. Practices that generated persistent conflict or failure were modified or abandoned. Groups that managed such conflicts more effectively displayed greater continuity over time. Error played a central role in this process. Failed actions produced information through consequence. This information was incorporated into future behavior. Over time, this reduced the range of acceptable actions and stabilized practice. The accumulation of such adjustments produced increasingly constrained behavioral repertoires. These repertoires limited the set of viable actions without requiring explicit reasoning. Constraint emerged through repetition rather than instruction. These early rule systems were local and contingent. Practices effective in one environment did not necessarily transfer to another. Environmental variation required continual adjustment. Rules remained tied to specific conditions and could not be easily generalized. When environmental conditions changed significantly, previously reliable practices could become ineffective. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence suggests that such mismatches produced periods of instability. Practices that had once ensured success could fail under new constraints. Learned practices often persisted even as conditions changed. Because rules were acquired through imitation and reinforced by earlier success, they tended to remain in use until repeated failure made their limitations observable. Adjustment occurred through consequence rather than anticipatory analysis. Current evidence does not allow reconstruction of how early humans conceptualized these constraints, if they conceptualized them at all. The archaeological record preserves tools, structures, and residues of activity, but not internal representations. Claims about belief, intention, or reflective reasoning exceed what the evidence supports and are therefore avoided. What can be stated with confidence is that structured behavior preceded structured reasoning. Rule following existed before rule description. Constraint preceded abstraction. This sequence appears consistently across early human activity. The emergence of logic as a formal system required an additional development. Rules had to become representable independently of immediate action. They had to be externalized in a form that allowed inspection, comparison, and correction. Prior to external marking, constraints existed only within individual memory and embodied practice. Transmission depended on continued participation and direct observation. When simple marks began to be made on objects such as bone or stone, patterns could persist beyond immediate action. These external records allowed quantities or sequences to endure independently of individual memory. Once recorded, such patterns could be revisited and modified. This development marked a significant change in how constraints were maintained, as rules could now exist outside the body and beyond their original context. In the next episode, we will examine abstraction before symbols,